Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into something we've all likely felt, but it's deeply complex. Heartbreak.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at it through, well, a whole range of sources: science, history, cultural traditions.
Exactly. Our mission for you listening is really to get past the simple stuff and build a really full picture of heartbreak in all its shapes.
We actually start with this really striking contrast in the sources. You've got Dr. Lena Muller in Berlin.
Right, the biomedical approach.
Yeah, looking at broken heart syndrome, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, actual physical weakening of the heart from emotional stress.
And then a world's away, literally in Oaxaca, there's Rosa Martinez.
The Curanera, performing Olympia, a spiritual cleanse.
Totally different view, seeing the
Yeah.
heart as, well, more than just muscle, a spiritual connection maybe.
Precisely. And these two examples, they just threw that core question right out there, don't they?
How do we square the science with the cultural and spiritual side of heartbreak, can we?
That's what we're digging into.
Okay, so let's start with just how universal this is. The sources really frame heartbreak as, like, fundamental human stuff, part of our heritage.
Absolutely. Think about Helen Fisher's work. The evolutionary angle.
The prairie voles.
Yeah, those little guys form strong bonds. When separated, they show signs of dopamine withdrawal.
Like addiction withdrawal.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
It suggests our capacity for attachment and the intense pain of losing it is wired in deep. For survival, even.
So it's not just feelings, it's biology, primal.
Definitely a core biological reality. But how cultures understand that pain, that varies hugely.
Like the Tamil Sangam poetry you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Centuries old, right?
Exactly. And it maps heartbreak onto landscapes, different flowers, different terrains.
Representing stages of love and loss.
Yeah. It wasn't seen as like a defect, more like our Parthasarathi calls it a terrain to be traversed, a curriculum for the soul.
Wow, a curriculum for the soul. That's powerful, very different from a dopamine dip.
Totally. But
Yeah.
then, colonialism arrived and really shook things up. Well, think about the burning of Babylon texts in the Philippines. These held indigenous spiritual knowledge, including views on heartbreak, wiped out.
So active suppression.
And dismissal too, like the Kunsan Num rituals, these communal healing dances for grief. Westerners often just dismiss them.
It wasn't just about religion then.
No, it was about dismantling whole ways of understanding and healing emotional pain, leaving a space for Western models to fill.
And you see the legacy today.
Yeah, many indigenous languages don't have direct words for things like depression. They use more holistic phrases.
Like Sonko Nene in Quechua.
Right. The heart grows heavy, it's more embodied, less clinical.
So you've got this tension. Neuroscience can pinpoint brain activity.
Yeah, the anterior cingulate cortex lighting up during rejection. Same area as physical pain, interestingly.
But that doesn't explain everything, does it?
Not really.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain why Rumi's poetry on heartbreak still resonates so deeply across centuries. There's something more there, maybe spiritual, maybe cultural, that the scan doesn't capture.
Okay, so we've seen it's universal but understood differently. Now let's get into how history, especially colonialism, actively redefined heartbreak.
Yeah, this part, it takes a bit of a darker turn. There's the story of Maria de San Jose in 16th century Mexico.
The healer who used traditional remedies.
Yes, like uloxochital for mal de corazon, sickness of the heart. She was tried and executed.
Executed. Just for using traditional medicine for heartbreak.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It shows how colonial powers could criminalize these practices, imposing their own, often religious framework onto emotional pain.
Forcibly replacing one understanding with another. Chilling.
And that pattern continued. Look at the Victorian era. Grief, especially female grief, became very privatized, pathologized even.
This hysteria diagnosis.
Exactly. Women admitted to asylums like Bedlam for being lovesick.
Mm-hmm.
It medicalized female emotion, brought it under control.
So heartbreak became, as one source puts it, a tool of control.
Pretty much. Used to regulate women's emotional lives.
Yeah.
And even seemingly good things could be twisted.
Like the ban on sati in India.
Right. Presented in the West as this great feminist act saving women. But for the British colonizers, it was also a strategic move.
To assert control.
Solidify dominance. It shows how complex motivations can be, even in seemingly moral actions.
Oh, that's a really sobering point. And then came the commodification.
Oh yeah, patent medicines. Think Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup.
I've heard of that one. Had morphine in it, didn't it?
It did. Marketed heavily for female complaints, basically turning distress, including heartbreak, into a product, making money off pain.
And that's still happening.
In different ways, absolutely. Like Adasuo Oni's Heartbreak Detox, teas, and Legos. They use elements from Yoruba traditions.
But is it authentic?
That's the question. Herbalist Funmilayo Adebayo raises concerns about appropriation, selling back ancestral knowledge but stripped of the prayers, the spiritual core.
Just the ingredients, not
Yeah,
the meaning.
Exactly. Which brings us neatly to the modern scientific view, especially neuroscience.
Dr. Naomi Eisenberger's fMRI studies.
Right. Showing social rejection lights up that same pain region in the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex again.
So rejection literally hurts.
That's the takeaway. It gave a biological grounding to that feeling, made it feel real, scientifically.
But again, science doesn't tell the whole story, does it?
No. Compare that to the Dagara concept of Pugbe.
Hogbe.
It means this deep communal disconnection, a rupture in social bonds, seen as a root cause of heartbreak. It needs communal ritual to heal.
So it's not just about my brain, but about the community's health.
Exactly. As Elder Malidoma Some said, science sees a brain scan, other cultures see a soul needing ritual restoration. It's a bigger picture.
And the biological data isn't always clear-cut either.
Right. You have studies showing cortisol spikes in divorced people.
Stress hormone, yeah.
But then other evidence suggests Keto Despacho rituals, these ceremonial offerings, might actually reduce cortisol.
Huh. So conflicting signals.
Which kind of creates an opening, doesn't it, for the pharmaceutical industry?
SSRIs for prolonged grief.
It's becoming more common. Even though, some big studies, like in The Lancet, show placebos can be surprisingly effective for milder distress.
So are we, maybe, medicalizing normal sadness?
That's the concern. Especially when you see things like sertraline, an antidepressant, marketed as a love failure tonic in India.
A love failure tonic, wow.
It really reframes heartbreak as a disorder needing a pill.
Psychiatrist Dr. Kalpana Besborough asks that question, right? When did crying become a disease?
Yeah, she points out that ancient texts, shlokas, acknowledge this deep pain. It's human, not necessarily pathology.
Which leads to this idea of reclaiming other ways of healing, integrating things.
Exactly. There's a real movement towards that, trying to blend science and tradition.
Like the Quechua elder Maria Crispe working with the neuroscientist Dr. Soto.
Yeah, studying cortisol levels during those despacho ceremonies. And they found cortisol dropped significantly afterwards.
So sort of biochemical validation for an ancient practice.
Kind of. It's like science is catching up to what traditions knew. And it's not just science and spirit, it's tech too.
The Cherokee Nation app, Sigayana.
Right. Blending cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, with AI-curated traditional stories. It's fascinating.
As the developer said, healing is not either. It's neurons and narrative.
Love that quote. And you see this hybridity elsewhere. Pentecostal churches in Ghana using Akin libation rituals.
Really? Integrating traditional rituals into Christian practice?
In some places, yeah. And some South African Sangomas, traditional healers, are using CBT alongside their Yukubiisa rituals for ancestral connection.
So people are getting creative, blending different toolkits.
Definitely. Even art and tech, like that TeamLab VR installation in Japan, Mono Nowhere, using heart rate sensors to interact with art about loss and impermanence.
Finding new ways to process these old feelings. But the sources also warn about, well, shadow economies around this.
Yeah, that's a crucial counterpoint. Cultural appropriation is a big one.
Like influencers selling Aboriginal grief rituals.
Exactly. Non-Indigenous people in Australia doing that, often ignoring the real political struggles of Indigenous communities. Elder Ruth Langford calls it spiritual theft.
Commodifying sacred practices without context or respect.
And it feeds into this larger grief tourism industry. Big money, often totally disconnected from the roots of these traditions.
Similar to the pharma companies using Ayurvedic imagery in India.
Right, co-opting traditional aesthetics to sell drugs for emotional distress. As Arjun Patel says, profiting from pain on multiple levels.
And technology has its own shadows here too.
For sure. Think about dating apps. That Tinder data leak showing algorithmic bias.
How does that relate?
Well, if the algorithm influences who sees who based on biased data, it could amplify racialized experiences of rejection. Tech isn't neutral.
Adding another layer of pain, potentially.
And then there's just the straight-up monetization of recovery. Apps like Breakup Boss, Premium Grief Coaching.
Making healing a product.
Yeah, accessible mainly if you can pay. Which is why grassroots things like the Heal, Our Men Circles in Nairobi are so important. Free, community support.
That contrast is really stark. Okay, another huge factor the sources highlight is gender.
Absolutely critical. How heartbreak is experienced, expressed, policed, it's deeply gendered.
But there's pushback. Like the Homens Coram movement in Brazil.
Yeah, using funk music to challenge machismo, encouraging men to actually show emotion, which is vital
They're
because
suppressing it has consequences.
real ones. That WHO study showing higher post-divorce mortality risk for men sticking to rigid gender roles. It's serious.
And the stigma affects women too, obviously.
Oh, definitely. Look at South Korea, the labels for divorced people, especially women. Use tissues, recyclables, horrible stuff.
But people are fighting back.
Yes, like Kim Ji-young's #IamNotWaste campaign, using social media to challenge that stigma head-on.
And what about queer perspectives? They must offer different insights.
Hugely important and often ignored. Kathui in Thailand reclaiming Basi ceremonies for healing. Traditional spirit-calling ceremonies, adapting them. And in the US, the Queer Ancestor Project preserving LGBTQ+ stories of love, loss, resilience.
Finding strength and healing and shared history and reclaimed traditions.
And art remains so powerful. #breakup bonds online, or Malak Madar, the Palestinian artist.
Using bullet casings in her art.
Yeah, transforming symbols of violence and loss into expressions of grief and resilience. It's incredibly moving.
So looking ahead, what's on the horizon? Policy, tech, healing.
Some really interesting potential developments. Policy-wise, look at Canada.
Funding integrated clinics.
Yes, like the Minobima Diziwin Center.
Yeah.
Combining Western medicine, fMRI scans, with traditional indigenous practices like sweat lodges. A real model for holistic care.
And intergenerationally.
You see Gen Z connecting with this stuff, that #ancestral grief trend on TikTok, trying to understand pain in a bigger historical family context.
Laws are shifting too.
Seems so. Oregon licensing coranders, the EU looking at an Emotional Data Protection Act, recognizing diverse healing and the need to protect our emotional data online.
But there are ethical flags being raised too, right?
Big time. For CRISPR gene editing, trials for heartbreak-proof genes.
Yeah.
That's a lot to consider.
Or VR memorials from companies like Meta.
Yeah, Jaron Lanier warns about the metaverse commodifying longing without real connection. Deep ethical questions there.
So where does that leave us?
Well, maybe where a neuroanthropologist loses research points. Understanding heartbreak is this dynamic thing between biology, culture, spirit, synapse, and soul working together.
Like the Inuit concept of sila.
Exactly. The breath, the spirit connecting everything. It suggests healing comes through connection on all levels.
So wrapping this deep dive up, the main takeaway seems to be that heartbreak isn't just one thing.
Not at all. It's physiological, cultural, spiritual, historical, all woven together. It shapes how we experience loss, how we cope.
And our understanding is constantly evolving, right?
Yeah.
Influenced by history, money, technology.
Definitely. But there's also this growing potential to integrate things, science and tradition, finding a more complete, more humane path to healing.
We started with that contrast, the Berlin hospital, the Oaxaca ritual.
And it's clear both offer something valuable, different lenses on the same deep human experience.
Which leads us to that final thought from the epilogue. Kind of a haunting question.
Yeah. If science can silence the heart's cry with a pill, will we forget how to sing it into the fire?
Makes you think, doesn't it? About what we gain and maybe what we lose, and how we deal with this fundamental part of being human.
A powerful question to end on. Thanks for exploring this with us. It really invites ongoing reflection for all of us.